For decades, Princess Anne has remained the stoic figure in the backdrop of Britain's most turbulent royal chapters. But while others courted the spotlight, she waged a battle the world never saw. Now, the palace can no longer contain the truth. What was the weight she bore in silence? And why has it taken years for the veil to finally be lifted? This is not a royal anecdote, it's a revelation that could shatter the family's controlled image. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. To the public, Princess Anne was always the emblem of quiet endurance, a woman who never flinched, never complained, and never strayed from duty. While headlines were flooded with scandals, marriages, and abdications, she remained the royal constant, unshaken, unsensational, unbothered. But beneath the surface of that rigid exterior, something far more harrowing was unfolding. The first crack came not from Anne herself, but from the walls of the palace she served so loyally. An anonymous leak, an internal communiqué from the royal press office circulated among senior correspondents just days before the annual Trooping the Colour, referencing an impending clarification on Princess Anne's historical standing within the royal apparatus. No one knew what to make of it until whispers of a long-withheld palace statement began circulating among insiders. This wasn't some ceremonial oversight or a trivial title dispute. Deep within palace corridors, royal archivists had begun quietly revisiting documents marked Sensitive Appendix Clarion Section 5th. Among them was a term never before seen in the public domain, the silent battle. The phrase, stark and without elaboration, appeared in at least 3 official records concerning Princess Anne's placement in royal governance. It wasn't just suggestive, it was damning. Why had this phrase been coded into documentation meant only for the monarch and his closest advisors? Why had Anne's historical role been subject to such internal re-evaluation? The tension only grew when questions emerged about roles she had allegedly been nominated for, then mysteriously withdrawn. Multiple sources suggested that she had been intended to assume oversight of Commonwealth transitional diplomacy during the early 2000s, yet her name was suddenly and permanently replaced without explanation. There were rumors, persistent and disturbing, about secret vetoes issued from within the highest ranks of the royal family. Vetoes that targeted Anne directly, ensuring she remained a support figure, never the lead. Unconfirmed yet widespread speculation implicated key players in influencing those decisions, shielding other senior royals while sidelining her behind closed doors. The internal whisper network pointed fingers at long-standing rivalries, veiled sexism, and fears that Anne's uncompromising approach would overshadow more politically favourable figures. What the palace had crafted as unity, insiders now called orchestration. The question no one dared to ask publicly was why her, and why for so long. The most haunting part of the leak was not what was said, but what was suggested. A sealed vault, a private archive belonging solely to Princess Anne, locked away under Windsor jurisdiction, now reportedly set to be opened by decree of King Charles himself. Its contents remain unknown, but palace sources confirm that its existence is real, its relevance critical, and its implications potentially devastating. It is there, many believe, where Anne's side of the story truly lives untouched, unread, and now on the brink of revelation. But before we uncover what Princess Anne endured behind closed doors, we must revisit the moment everything changed when one act of quiet defiance set her on a collision course with the very crown she served. She said no, and the monarchy trembled. In an institution bound by obedience, Princess Anne's quiet refusal of a royal directive decades ago sent invisible cracks through the palace walls. Hidden from the public, this single decision marked the beginning of a conflict buried beneath layers of protocol and deception. It was the early 1990s, and a discreet policy still guided royal operations behind palace gates, one that limited high-level diplomatic roles for female royals outside the direct line of succession. While the public marveled at the family's ceremonial pageantry, few knew that key positions on the global stage were carefully steered away from Anne, despite her unmatched experience and commitment. when an internal briefing recommended she be assigned a symbolic overseas role rather than a leadership position in the Commonwealth restructuring initiative, Anne responded in the most unexpected way. She refused. Without raising her voice or staging a rebellion, she quietly declined the appointment, an action almost unheard of within the royal inner circle. Her reasoning was simple, yet devastating. She would not serve as decoration when she had already proven herself capable of command. Behind closed doors, the consequences were swift and severe. A closed-door session was convened, Queen Elizabeth herself present alongside senior advisors and the Lord Chamberlain. The confrontation, while never publicly confirmed, became part of palace legend. Anne, unwavering in tone but cutting in conviction, reportedly reminded them all that she had stood in the trenches of royal duty while others stumbled. The Queen, caught between maternal instinct and monarchical rigidity, said little. But from that moment forward, Anne's access began to shrink. Her requests for expanded diplomatic engagements were repeatedly stalled. Travel plans were redirected or delayed under the guise of rebalancing schedules. Patronage recommendations that once sailed through the system began to vanish in a sea of procedural fog. Internally, the punishment was wrapped in silence, no formal reprimand, no public fallout, just quiet erasure. And yet, Anne refused to push back publicly. She chose discretion not because she accepted the injustice, but because she understood the weight of discord inside the family she had sworn to protect. Duty before discord. The phrase she once reportedly whispered to a trusted aide became her personal mantra. But within the Lord Chamberlain's office, the tone was far more cutting. In one unearthed memo, her stance was described as disruptive yet loyal, a phrase that revealed the palace's deepest discomfort. Anne was not rebellious, she was principled. And principles are far harder to contain than scandal. The palace may have hoped her silence meant submission. But what they failed to understand was that Anne's refusal wasn't an end, it was a beginning. Because beneath the surface of that quiet act lay the seeds of a challenge far more dangerous than any spoken rebellion. Yet this was only the beginning. Anne's resistance wasn't just personal. It threatened to expose a deeper fracture within the family's treatment of women in power. Deep beneath the gilded surface of royal order lies a network never discussed in public, the Shadow Council. And according to newly revealed records, they were tasked with one chilling mission: contain Princess Anne. Their tool, a protocol designed to erase her influence without ever naming her directly. It began quietly, without ceremony or signature. A buried document marked only as Protocol Clarion subsection 5 was drafted in the aftermath of Anne's early defiance, a clause shrouded in bureaucratic language but loaded with consec. The clause permitted a council of select senior advisors to exercise what they called royal discretionary restraint, a phrase that sounded harmless but operated like an invisible leash. This group, known internally as the Shadow Council, was never listed publicly. But their fingerprints were all over a decade of calculated decisions that saw Anne diminished, redirected and muted under the guise of strategy. It wasn't an outright exile, it was an orchestration of irrelevance. Speeches approved by her office were returned redacted, trimmed of policy remarks, stripped of geopolitical nuance. Entire foreign briefings were mysteriously lost en route, only to be reissued with critical intelligence omitted. What the public interpreted as Anne's measured neutrality was, in truth, an edited script handed to her moments before stepping into view. Behind this quiet sabotage were palace aides fiercely loyal to Prince Philip, men who believed in a rigid hierarchy and saw Anne's growing global popularity as a risk to royal stability. Anne's commanding presence abroad, especially in Commonwealth regions that had long felt overlooked by the Crown, was viewed not as an asset but as an unregulated power source, and that made her dangerous. As a result, her assignments were carefully diluted. While she was dispatched to dignified but peripheral events, more central figures, often with far less experience, were placed in roles designed for greater visibility. At key milestones, Anne was strategically placed just out of frame. The manipulation was never openly acknowledged, but it was documented in cautious language, in passive voice, in shadows. And when the Royal Archive was forced to release selected documents under mounting internal scrutiny, a chilling thread of correspondence emerged. Letters between Clarence House and the Queen's private secretary carried coded references to HRH2 and notes about limiting independent interpretation. One line stood out like a dagger: ensure minimal disruption from the princess's spontaneous commentary. They weren't just watching Anne, they were curating her. Every movement she made was filtered through a lens of threat assessment. And yet, despite the strategic silencing, Anne never erupted. She never exposed it. Because her rebellion was quieter, more precise. A resistance that spoke through timing, choice, and omission. But even as they sought to silence her, Anne found her voice through unspoken rebellion and one hidden relationship that would become both her sanctuary and her greatest risk. They said she stood alone. But now, palace documents confirm she wasn't entirely in the shadows. For years, Anne nurtured a covert alliance, one forged in trust, secrecy, and resistance. And it may have been the only thing that kept her from breaking. The year was 1998. The monarchy was reeling in the aftermath of Diana's death. The press relentless, the public restless, and the walls of the institution cracking under scrutiny. Amidst the chaos, Princess Anne quietly initiated a series of weekly meetings with a man never photographed, never named in official ledgers, a senior MI5 liaison whose operational codename was withheld even from most internal records. This alliance, buried beneath the palace's rigid hierarchy, was known only in fragments under a term later uncovered during the archival declassification process, Sentinel Guardian. It was not a nickname, it was an operational label attached to a string of encrypted documents that tracked Anne's growing concerns over the monarchy's internal instability and the looming threats to royal continuity. But the alliance was far more personal than strategic. In the confidential files now made public by King Charles's own authorization, Anne described not political tact, but the unbearable emotional weight of betrayal from within her own family. In those classified conversations, she confided feelings of helplessness. Her position within the firm had become ceremonial in title but silent in consequence. Repeatedly overlooked, deliberately excluded from decision-making tables, she was fighting a battle for relevance and losing. The alliance with her MI5 contact wasn't about surveillance or subversion, it was about survival. Through him, she received reports, some redacted, others clear, about global risks to the monarchy, shifts in public perception, and covert internal efforts to discredit her contributions abroad. More than once, it was suggested that Anne's foresight about modernizing royal structures had quietly influenced decisions later implemented under others' names. She never claimed credit, but she watched, patiently, as the same reforms she had voiced in hushed tones through Sentinel Guardian came to pass in public under entirely different authorship. What remained hidden until now was the evidence. Hidden microphones in the Windsor East Wing, installed not to spy but to preserve, captured hours of confidential dialogues between Anne and her trusted contact. Until recently, they were locked under Level 4 clearance, a classification that even most senior royals couldn't override. It was King Charles, in one of his earliest executive decisions as monarch, who quietly ordered those recordings declassified. What emerged wasn't scandal, it was heartbreak. In one emotional exchange, Anne admits, "Sometimes I wonder if they see me as an heir or just a shadow." The pain in her voice was not political. It was deeply personal. She wasn't battling for glory. She was battling to be heard in a family that only valued noise when it served narrative. And yet, even with this one trusted ally shielding her in silence, Anne's deepest wounds would not come from protocol or politics. They came from blood. Because in the moments she most needed loyalty, those she once protected were the first to look away. But even with a trusted ally in the shadows, Anne's greatest wound came from within, from those she once protected, who turned their backs when she needed them most. She was the palace's fiercest protector, until they made her the target. In an act that remains redacted from many official accounts, Anne was systematically removed from multiple royal initiatives she helped build. But why would loyalty threaten the crown? The answer reveals a family betrayal no one expected. Few recall that it was Princess Anne, not any heir apparent or consort in waiting, who meticulously developed the first framework for royal charity accountability, a system designed to shield the monarchy from future scandals and ensure transparent distribution of donations across the Commonwealth. It was a labor of integrity and foresight, born not out of ambition but responsibility. Anne believed that modern monarchy demanded credibility, and she fought relentlessly to make that vision a reality. But somewhere between progress and power, her influence became inconvenient. Without explanation, and without public notice, the very responsibilities she had cultivated were reassigned. Not to a neutral entity, but to Camilla and a cluster of newly elevated figures whose ascent conveniently aligned with the changing tides of royal hierarchy. Anne's name, once proudly etched into founding charters, began to disappear. Official correspondence that bore her signature was reissued with alternate endorsements. Her involvement was not simply minimized, it was erased. Those closest to her remember the shift vividly. It was after the 2007 internal summit on royal philanthropic transparency that Anne's demeanor changed. Until then, she had maintained her inner strength, a quiet resolve. But following that gathering where senior roles were reshuffled without her knowledge, insiders describe Anne retreating from the inner sanctum of royal strategy. Not in protest, but in heartbreak. A withdrawal not of defiance but of grief. What remains perhaps the most haunting detail in this quiet expulsion is that she sought to stop it. Sources close to Clarence House reveal that Anne made a direct private plea to Prince Charles, her brother, her equal in rank, and the only one with the power to reverse the decision. But he refused. Whether out of indifference, political convenience, or deference to external pressure remains unclear. What is clear is that Anne left that meeting stripped not just of responsibility but of trust. In a monarchy built on lineage and blood, the sting of familial betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from those you've stood beside in silence. And then, from an entirely unexpected corner, came the most chilling validation of her suspicion. During the cataloguing of Princess Margaret's estate, a diary was recovered never before made public. Until now, one entry, dated spring of 1994, read simply, "Anne will never wear the crown, but she carries its weight." The forgotten heir. It was more than a reflection. It was a warning, a recognition that even within the family itself, Anne's role was not misunderstood, it was deliberately diminished. But fate was not finished with her story. For while the palace pushed her aside, global events created a perfect storm, one that forced the monarchy to reconsider everything they had suppressed. You can silence a voice at home, but not when the world starts listening. During a diplomatic mission that was never supposed to make headlines, Princess Anne reignited global fascination. What she said in one off-camera moment reverberated across continents and forced the monarchy to confront the legacy they tried to bury. It began as an understated engagement. The 2022 Commonwealth Summit in Ghana wasn't even on the official royal schedule for Anne. She had offered to attend in a private capacity without press, without ceremony, without expectation. But the outcome shattered every plan to keep her out of the spotlight. As she arrived, tens of thousands gathered in Accra, chanting her name and waving flags not because they were told to, but because they remembered. They remembered the only royal who had visited them consistently without fanfare, without condescension, and without forgetting. Anne, who had once been sidelined for being too independent, was now being celebrated as the only royal who had never wavered. The palace couldn't control the optics, and they couldn't contain what happened next. In a brief, unguarded moment, Anne was caught on a hot mic in conversation with Ghana's Prime Minister. The line was short, almost whispered, but deafening in its consequence. "They tried to keep me out," she said, half laughing, half resigned. It wasn't a declaration, it was a confirmation, and within hours it exploded. Social media erupted with clips, subtitles, and commentary. Hashtags like #SilentRoyalPower and #AnneWasRight trended for days. For the first time in decades, the public wasn't asking why Anne had disappeared. They were demanding to know who pushed her out. And more importantly, why she had stayed silent for so long. The international press quickly picked up the story, but it was the reaction inside the UK's Foreign Office that truly shifted the tide. Diplomats, long frustrated by optics-driven choices from Buckingham Palace, began applying pressure. Anne's familiarity with Commonwealth leaders, Her diplomatic rapport and her ironclad consistency had created relationships that no newly appointed figure could replicate. Suddenly, her A.B. sense wasn't just a scandal, it was a liability. And as the new king, Charles found himself caught in a treacherous loyalty test. Would he side with tradition and the quiet machinery that had orchestrated Anne's erasure? Or would he acknowledge the silent storm building beneath the crown? Behind palace gates, emergency briefings were held. A directive circulated, marked high urgency, historical review requested. What followed was the start of something once unthinkable: the declassification of the silent battle files. A collection of restricted communications, personal letters, internal memos, and operational policies that had governed Anne's constrained trajectory for over 3 decades. For the first time, the institution that had buried the truth was being forced to confront it, not out of remorse but out of necessity. Because now, the world was watching, and the more they uncovered, the more they questioned everything. As public pressure surged and historical revision began, the final spark came not from the press but from inside the palace itself. It was never meant to be seen. The palace vaults held years of Anne's sealed letters, suppressed reports, and audio confessions. But under Charles's reluctant command, it was unlocked. And what it revealed wasn't just a silent battle, it was a heartbreak, a warning, and a reckoning for the royal family. The internal directive bore the codename Clarion Appendix 3, Authorization to Unseal. It was issued not during a press briefing or council session, but through a midnight order, signed quietly and distributed to only 5 senior officials. The order permitted access to a segment of the Windsor Vault marked Anne, restricted correspondence, a section that had remained locked since the late 1990s. It was said to contain what Anne herself referred to as her unfiled truths documents never intended for publication, but preserved in case history required a correction. The first item pulled was a handwritten letter addressed to her mother, Queen Elizabeth II. In it, Anne pleads not for attention, but for acknowledgement. "If I am not to be trusted with roles, then tell me why," she wrote. "If the burden of lineage is not mine to bear, then let the silence be broken by something more than protocol." The letter, palace officials confirmed, had never been answered. What followed was far more painful. An audio file preserved on magnetic tape dated March 2004. In it, Anne can be heard speaking in a low, breaking voice. It is not a statement, it is not a complaint. It is the sound of a woman questioning her place in the only institution she had never abandoned. "They are rewriting the future," she says, "and they are doing it without me. I am not meant to vanish, but that is what they are choosing." The weight of the words was more than emotional, it was institutional. Alongside these recordings were formal memos that confirmed long-held suspicions. Anne had been nominated to inherit multiple ceremonial and strategic titles that were later reassigned, without explanation, to others far less qualified. The files included her name penciled into early drafts of roles, now associated with Camilla, and at least 2 appointments that were originally structured around Anne's unique experience in foreign policy. But it was one quote, written hastily in the margins of a redacted draft of the 2007 Sovereign Duties Report, that chilled investigators the most. In her own handwriting, Anne had scrawled, "You may all wear crowns, but I carried the burden." A single sentence that cut through decades of silence and loyalty, a sentence that revealed the depth of what had been endured and what had been lost. The palace, sensing the scale of what had been unearthed, issued an unprecedented public statement. It was short, restrained, and saturated with coded regret. "We acknowledge that historical missteps have occurred. We recognize that service often comes without ceremony, and we offer our respect to all who have endured in silence." No names were mentioned, but the world knew who they were referring to. But acknowledgement is not atonement, and as Anne stepped into the light once more, she chose not vengeance but legacy. She never wanted a throne. But after years of exile from influence, Princess Anne returned not to seek validation but to redefine what power meant. Her quiet ascension marked the beginning of a new chapter, one not written in decrees but in resolve. The announcement came with little fanfare, but its impact rippled through the institution. Princess Anne was appointed Royal Steward of the Crown Legacy Initiative, a position that did not previously exist, and one that she herself helped architect. It was not about ceremony or status. It was about ensuring that the lessons buried beneath decades of silence would never be forgotten again. The role granted her sweeping oversight of historical preservation, charitable direction, and royal succession education, but more than that, it re-established her voice, this time with permanence. In her first public appearance following the appointment, Anne delivered a speech that would become the defining line of her second emergence. "What is earned," she said calmly, "will always outlast what is bestowed." The words, wrapped in modesty, cut deeper than any royal proclamation in recent memory. It wasn't just the public who listened. Within the palace, younger royals began to quietly orbit Anne, seeking her wisdom, her strength, and most importantly, her truth. Lady Louise, who had long admired her aunt's restraint, began consulting with Anne on ceremonial responsibilities. Princess Beatrice requested Anne's guidance before taking on a new educational patronage. Even Princess Charlotte, still just beginning her path, asked to shadow Anne during a private diplomatic engagement. These weren't orchestrated appearances, these were private acts of reverence. The women of the royal family, once expected to serve from the margins, now looked to Anne as a standard of unshakable resolve. Outside the walls of the monarchy, the response was equally dramatic. Polling conducted in the months following her reappointment showed a staggering rise in public trust and admiration toward Anne. The tabloids, once dismissive, now referred to her as the real Iron Lady of Windsor, a moniker that captured not only her strength, but the quiet fire that had refused to extinguish even when the institution tried to suffocate it. Analysts who once argued Anne was too far removed to influence the future now conceded that she had become a silent architect of what was to come. Her input was suddenly requested at succession briefings, her voice recorded at planning tables she had once been barred from entering. But Anne never framed this as a return. She called it a reorientation, an evolution of what her duty had always been. There were no grand demands, no gestures of revenge, only a quiet reclamation of space that had always been hers by merit. She redefined power not as something inherited, but as something proven. And the monarchy, once content to forget her, now leaned on the very resolve it once read. But even in triumph, Anne remains enigmatic, and just when the world thought the revelations were over, one final chapter was discovered in a locked case marked for the future guardian. Buried under layers of archival red tape, a final letter emerged, addressed not to the public, not to her brother, but to a future heir. In it, Anne reveals the full cost of her silent battle, and the chilling truth about what she feared most if history repeated itself. The case was labeled in plain handwriting, without emblem or stamp, and sealed with a wax insignia known only to the Windsor archivists. Inside was a single envelope, yellowed at the edges, addressed simply, "To the next who waits in silence." It was opened under official supervision, but the message was not meant for them. It was for Princess Charlotte. The letter, titled "If They Silence You Too," was written at a time when Anne's exclusion from palace governance was at its peak, and her sense of invisibility had become too sharp to ignore. But instead of bitterness, the letter carried something deeper: warning, wisdom, and a kind of armor only pain can craft. In its pages, Anne spoke candidly of the loneliness that comes with being capable, the sting of having to protect those who overlook you, and the cruelty of a crown that demands devotion yet offers none in return when it matters most. "You will be watched," Anne wrote, "smile anyway." And then, more quietly, "Your power isn't in the title, it's in what they try to keep from you." These were not platitudes. They were instructions etched from decades of withholding tears, bearing burdens, and walking corridors that echoed with deference but not respect. Palace aides reported that Charlotte, now old enough to understand the weight of legacy, wept when she read it. Not from fear, but from recognition. Recognition that power doesn't always come with a throne and The truest leaders are often the ones written out of history until they force their way back in. The letter, once made public, sparked a wave that no one saw coming. Millions shared it across the world with the hashtag The Guardian, turning her long-dismissed resilience into a rallying cry for women who had been sidelined, not because they were unworthy, but because they were unshakable. And within the palace, another moment passed quietly but powerfully. Catherine, speaking privately to a close confidant, reportedly said, "Anne bled so we could lead. It was not a soundbite, it was a reckoning." An acknowledgement that behind every elevation of a new royal woman stood the unseen sacrifices of the one who came before, uncelebrated, unthanked, but undefeated. So ends the silence, not with a shout, but with a revelation. Princess Anne's story was never about recognition. It was about resilience. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.